Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support in making the Signature Lecture Series a success. I'd also like to thank the Balsley School of International Affairs for their support in making tonight's event possible. Besides the audience here, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI, or if you're watching online through the chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our guest here on stage. This evening, we welcome to CIGI a very distinguished guest who's been a longtime friend of our organization and our community. The Right Honourable Joe Clark will speak tonight on shifts in politics at the global level. Introducing Mr. Clark tonight is CIGI's Vice President of Programs, Dr. David DeWitt, who joined CIGI in July of 2011 and has been overseeing the strategy and implementation of our research-related activities. Previously, Dr. DeWitt was Associate Vice President of Research, Social Sciences and Humanities, Professor of Political Science, and University Professor at York University in Toronto. David is the author or contributing editor of numerous books, refereed articles and chapters, in addition to commissioned papers on Canadian foreign, security and defense policy, international and regional security and conflict management in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East, arms control and proliferation, and human security. So please welcome David DeWitt.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to welcome all of you to this evening's event. Before turning to the formal introduction of our guest speaker, let me take this opportunity to recognize Ms. Maureen McTeer, an acknowledged national expert and leader. An acknowledged national expert and leader on the law and public policy concerning health, science, and reproductive technologies. It just so happens that our partner is Joe Clark. 23 years ago, spring 1990, I had the privilege to present at a series of roundtables at the Pearson Building in Ottawa, chaired by our guest tonight, the Right Honourable Joe Clark, then Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. The principal theme a number of us were asked to consider focused on the implications for Canada's position and role in world affairs in the wake of the ending of the Cold War. At the table were assistant deputy ministers, directors general, as well as a host of other officials, along with a few of us from outside government, and Mr. Clark. Among the many things that impressed me at those meetings was a clear commitment to examine critically our assumptions about how the world worked and what were Canada's obligations and responsibilities, as well as opportunities. It might seem trite now, when reflecting on it, to observe that in the shadow of 40 years of post-World War II Cold War architecture, there was no obvious, no necessary so-called New World Order that people spoke about. The presumption that the so-called West had won, and now all would be well, was simply yet another myth to be added to the many which were used to manage those previous 4 decades. As you will recall, within a few years, the so-called peace dividend was torn asunder, and wars and internal conflicts and civil strife was prevalent across the globe. Where would Canada fit, and what would Canada do? Perhaps lead. Perhaps lead from beside in this world of uncertain transition. Mr. Clark, along with many of his best officials, was instrumental in ensuring that Canada and Canadians did not too readily succumb to wishes rather than to the pragmatism of engaging the challenges of the post-Cold War transition, but a pragmatism that combined aspiration with some clearly articulated interests and a respect for norms and ideals and principles. My work with him and his colleagues in the North Pacific Cooperative Security Dialogue was one of but a number of initiatives undertaken during his time in office. Another, some of you will undoubtedly recall, for which he is well known and widely recognized, was his role as founding chairman of the Commonwealth Committee of Foreign Ministers on Southern Africa, which coordinated the Commonwealth campaign against apartheid. Of course, Mr. Clark had unique stature as our foreign minister, having already served as Canada's youngest prime minister and then going on to serve later as Minister of Constitutional Affairs, where he led the negotiation of the Charlottetown Accord. Mr. Clark was elected from Alberta to the House of Commons 8 times. In recent years, Mr. Clark has been active on governance issues in the developing world with the Commonwealth, the Carter Centre, the National Democratic Institute, including active discussions sponsored by NDI and the European Union on means to improve governance assistance to developing nations. He is president of Joe Clark and Associates, a professor of the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University, vice chair of Global Leadership Foundation, and a member of the Inter-American Dialogue and the Friends of the Inter-American Charter. And that is only a partial list. He also once enthralled my undergraduate honors seminar in Canadian foreign policy on his way to teach his own students at American University in Washington, where he was a visiting professor, a position he also had held at the University of California at Berkeley. Born in High River, Mr. Clark has been the recipient of numerous national and international awards, including the Companion of the Order of Canada and honorary degrees from a number of universities and colleges in Canada and abroad. He was a founding member of the Pacific Council for International Policy, has served as a special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Cyprus, and is the author of Canada, A Nation Too Good to Lose. There is much more that one could say, but now it is time to invite the Right Honourable Joe Clark to the podium and to welcome him to CIGI, to the BSIA, and to Kitchener-Waterloo. His signature lecture is entitled Leading from Beside.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back at CIGI and back in Waterloo in these spanking new premises, not perhaps as new to you as they are to me, but they are very impressive. Although when I was in here earlier, one of the secrets Fred didn't tell you is they made me do a voice test to make sure that my voice wasn't too squeaky for the microphones. And as I looked up at this audience, I thought, for someone who, for most of his public speaking life, was 2 swords lengths away from the opposition, this is a vast hall, and I hope that, an even more vast audience, as I understand. I have one other qualification, David, that you didn't mention. Maureen and I are now grandparents, and I won't bore you with long stories, but I will tell you one, because our 4-year-old grandson, he was then 3, uttered a phrase that I think is very much worth writing books about. It was summer. He was being tempted into the water to swim. His older sister is a very adept swimmer. He was quite reluctant, but he finally allowed himself to go in so long as his dad was holding onto his trunks as the waves came in and out. And Dad let go, and Charlie was moving along in the water, and his sister said, "Charlie, Charlie, you're swimming." He said, "I'm not swimming, I'm sinking." And I thought, that's a lesson and a phrase that many of us should probably remember as we go forward in life. Let me also say, if I might, about David, that he is a little modest in terms of the role he played with us, with me, back all those decades ago. He talked about the North Pacific Security Dialogue. One of the things we did not do at External Affairs, as it then was, as well as I had hoped we would, was to develop a connection with the academic community. I'm not sure why we were not more successful, but we weren't. But there were 3 or 4 startling exceptions, but one of them certainly was when David DeWitt and Dr. Paul Evans came to me with a proposal that given the turbulence in the North Pacific area and given the absence of the kind of institutional framework that might allow those issues of conflict to be dealt with, there needed to be some leadership in drawing people together to establish a framework that was not too formal, because Asia-Pacific was not a place then that would accept formal arrangements, particularly if they looked like they were imported from Europe. Most of the powers of that time, with influence in the region, did not want any discussion of that kind, because they were quite happy with the status quo as they saw it. But we believed that there was a need and a niche and an opportunity for Canada, and thanks largely to the academic expertise that these 2 professors who wandered into my office possessed, we were able to start a process that continues to be celebrated by people who were part of it literally over decades. Now, I'm going to speak tonight about leading from beside. I'm not so bold as to propose a whole foreign policy in 40 minutes, but I would welcome your views on one element of a policy that would be appropriate for one country, this country, with our specific and unique assets and associations. I draw, as Dr. DeWitt has said, upon 3 perspectives, all of them heavily qualified by the adjective former: a former foreign minister, a former party leader and prime minister, and a former minister of constitutional affairs. In fact, when I was moved from the Department of External Affairs, where I'd had the privilege of serving almost 7 years, to become the Minister of Constitutional Affairs, our daughter Catherine looked at me and said, "Well, so long, Paris, hello, Moose Jaw," which is what happened. I learned a little bit along the way. We all know that power among nations is shifting dramatically. Goldman Sachs has projected that by 2050, the 7 largest economies in the world will contain only one Western nation, the USA, which will rank 2nd in economic power, well behind China. Next in order would be India, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, Indonesia. Canada would rank 16th, a little behind Vietnam, a little ahead of the Philippines. Now, ranking growth is an economic calculation. Obviously, this shift in power is about more than economics. It is about culture. It is about language and attitudes, and indeed about values. The shift is also not just among nations, but among continents. Asia, obviously, but Africa, long the neglected continent, and now on the rise, and the new dynamics in this hemisphere, where power is dispersing and moving south. What we recognize less easily is that this shift in power is not only among nation states, but from nation states to non-state actors, such as the environmental movement, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, personal foundations. Now, sophisticated social scientists would call the groups I've just listed the good guys. But shifting also, this power is, to organized crime, to terrorists, and to other malign forces, the bad guys. Obviously, these changes have consequences whose implications are hard to foresee, and very often even harder to accept. Some of you will know of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which, as you would deduce, are in Southeast Asia. And there has been a practice for some time, happily, during the time I was foreign minister, that each year the foreign minister of Canada would go to one of the ASEAN capitals and would be engaged in what was called a dialogue partnership with the 6 who were there. We were hosted each year by a particular nation. And after I'd been there 6 years, and had been the guest of ASEAN 6 times, I decided it would be time to invite the ASEAN ministers, while they were in North America, to come to visit me for a special meeting. And we decided, just coincidentally, to hold that meeting in Jasper, Alberta, in my electoral constituency. They were all here in any event for the fall meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, so I invited them to come on Canadian Thanksgiving to be with me in Jasper. And having learned some things along the way as a foreign minister, for example, the most important proficiency in Southeast Asia is to be able to golf. It is an essential element to effective diplomacy, and I wasn't very good at that aspect of it. But nonetheless, I invited them to all come to me for a golfing weekend at Jasper. And of course, Canada being Canada, Alberta being Alberta, on Thanksgiving weekend, a terrible blizzard struck Alberta. And we made it to Calgary. We were supposed to fly from Calgary to a little town called Hinton with an airstrip. Hinton was closed, and it looked like we might have to cancel. And then we realized that Alberta being Alberta, this snowstorm had not hit the Banff-Jasper Highway for some reason. So we made our way to Banff, and we rented a bus. And we took the bus up that spectacular highway. If you've not taken it, I recommend that you do. And we got about to the ice fields on a perfectly clear highway, turned a corner, and a great blizzard struck us. Now, among the foreign ministers there was the foreign minister of Brunei, who also, just coincidentally, was the younger brother to the Sultan, the prince he was. And I was a little concerned about the prince and snow, so as this blizzard struck us, I said, "Your Royal Highness, I suppose you've not seen snow before." And Ali Alatas, the late Ali Alatas, the then foreign minister of Indonesia, piped up and said, "His Royal Highness has never been on a bus before." Now, all of us have buses that we have not been on before. We see the world from our own perspective, sometimes a perspective of privilege or of nostalgia, sometimes of anger or despair, sometimes of indifference. And often our views reflect a past which we knew and prefer, rather than a present which keeps surprising us. My title, Leading from Beside, was inspired directly by the controversy in the United States 2 years ago about whether foreign military assistance in Libya would be led by France and Britain rather than by the United States. A White House advisor, put that in quotes because that person has never been identified, supported the very sensible proposition that the U.S. need not lead every international venture. But that person was careless enough to describe that policy as leading from behind. American hawks went wild, and that description was quickly disowned. But rhetoric aside, there has been a palpable change in power. Other countries now have a growing capacity to be at the front of the line, and it is inevitable that much leadership now will be not singular, but shared. That will be complicated. In fact, allow me the modest suggestion that a Center for Governance Innovation needs to help hone the skills of fellowship as well as leadership in this complicated world. It's natural that as power disperses in the world, so does the capacity to lead. And the most effective leadership will have to be shared, not only among states, but with other entities and often with citizens. So I argue now that the model should be leadership from beside. Now, in speeches where I try to stir national pride and purpose, I say that is what Canada and Canadians have often done. I'll spare you that refrain, but certainly feel free to dispute it if you wish at the end of my remarks. Speakers should never give away their secrets, but my secret is I'm now turning to an insert that I prepared after the main address was prepared, and so I'm taking off the paperclip, and I will turn to the insert. In Canada's case, when I say beside, I mean beside three broad categories of partner. First, to use a phrase that I learned on about the third day I was foreign minister, the phrase like-minded countries. I kept getting these briefs to tell me this is what like-minded countries believed, and I said, what in the world are they? They are countries who generally approach international issues from a perspective similar to Canada's. So one of our partners should be like-minded countries. But the contemporary list would, while it would include our existing key allies, I would also expand the concept to include emerging and developing countries which share our interest and our capacity for conciliation and who are deliberate innovators. Second, as a partner, I believe it is imperative to Canada that we return to our role as an active and outspoken champion of the multilateral system, including emphatically the United Nations, but also seeking to bring purpose and effectiveness to our traditional families, like the Commonwealth, La Francophonie, the Organization of American States, and to encourage the strength of promising new alliances, including those of which we will not be formally a part, such as the African Union. And third, and critically, our partner should be non-state actors. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as a priority, because there is so much potential there, but it is accompanied by an abiding wariness of working too closely with governments. But the partnership should also be with other non-state actors, corporations, cooperatives, trade unions, scientists, faith groups, with a deliberate attempt to engage more of the world's citizens more directly and more consistently in international issues. On the question of multilateralism, I should draw upon my extensive, unparalleled international experience to tell you about one particular multilateral meeting where I had the privilege of leading Canada to what turned out to be the negotiation of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. Like all important discussions, this one began with a cocktail party. And there was a particular foreign minister, I won't identify the country, who'd been preparing for this cocktail party pretty much all day. And was in pretty great shape by the time he hove into the room. And he hove into the room at about the time the lights were going down and the music was going up. And he saw across the hall what he described as a vision in red. So he made his way over to that person and said, "Would you dance with me?" And the vision in red said, "No, and for 3 reasons. First, I don't dance. Second, that music, That music is our national anthem. And third, I am the Archbishop of Montevideo. So you can see why I want us to get back to the multilateral tradition. Among other things, the dynamic of relations between established and emerging nations will be affected by age. The proportion of India's population that is under age 15 is more than double the proportion in Germany. In those emerging powers, India, Brazil, China, the young populations, the potential generators of growth and of innovation, are dramatically larger than the older populations, who will need support and services. A startling proportion of the population of countries in conflict is under age 15. 46% in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a huge and troubled country. 46% in Afghanistan. 44% in Yemen. 43% in Iraq. 42% in the Palestinian territory. That's one change of which we have to take account, one dynamism from which we cannot be excluded. In the economic sphere in this changing world, there are quite exotic developments. For example, Global Trends reports, and I'm quoting, of the world's 100 largest economic entities in 2009, 44 were corporations, not countries, corporations. And the largest of those corporations was Walmart. Indeed, if Walmart were a country, it would be the 22nd largest country in the world. Fully 95 real countries have populations smaller than Walmart's workforce. The modern world is so much more than a story of states. A growing array of non-state actors are powers unto themselves, and they work on the front line of change. Greenpeace has had more influence on public policy in the last decade and a half than most national governments. The Gates Foundation is more innovative. The Red Cross, Red Crescent employs more than 300,000 people. And that is just the beginning of the non-state list. World Vision is in 97 countries, with over 40,000 staff and more than 100,000 volunteers. Many non-state actors are rooted in the global south, like BRAC in Bangladesh, the largest NGO in the world. Amnesty International has offices in 80 countries, more national offices than most countries have embassies. These groups have more than numbers and more than reach. They are innovators. They're on the ground. They're able to act directly. They're not bound by some formal protocol which a state may have signed, or some accountability provision requiring the approval of an official thousands of miles away. I was in Nigeria at the time of the last election. We have a rule now in Canada that heads of mission, our high commissioners, cannot speak on important matters without having their speech approved by Ottawa. There were killings in Nigeria after the election. The British spoke, the Americans spoke. It was a weekend, so Chris Cooter, our High Commissioner, had to wait for permission. Now, happily, I was there, and Nigeria doesn't keep a precise count of who's the foreign minister or the prime minister now, so Canada was heard from. But nonetheless, these accountability rules stop action. On a critical question like that, Canadians may not believe it, but the voice of Canada, the voice of Britain, the voice of the United States can make a difference when there are turbulent times which need to be calmed. Non-state actors are not bound by these kinds of protocols. Increasingly, as governments contract, they are filling space vacated when formal governments step back. Perhaps of most importance, they build personal trust, which is the basis of creative partnerships. Globescan International, the polling company, of which I have the privilege to serve on the board, and whose co-CEO, out of duty and out of interest, is here tonight. Globescan International has looked at this question of trust, and it reports, quotes, that trust in NGOs is significantly higher than trust in business, media, and governments, and continues to rise slowly. The 2012 report of the Edelman Trust Barometer says NGOs are the most trusted institution in the world. But what these non-state actors do not have is the authority to change the rules. Non-state organizations often have the imagination the world needs, but only states have the mandate and the power to change laws and regulations and obligations. In order to make the most of creative, constructive, can-do forces in the world, we need to marry mandate and imagination, as Canada and other countries have done in so many strong, purpose-specific partnerships with non-state organizations in the past. The International Treaty to Ban Landmines, the Campaign Against Apartheid, the Agreement on Blood Diamonds, the domestic responses to international disasters. Unfortunately, governments and publics pay more attention now to the non-state bad guys, which pose, quotes, new threats, than to those actors who represent new solutions. The disproportion is enormous between the money and the attention which Western governments spend on defense and on homeland security compared to the investment in non-state actors who address conditions which so often give rise to violence and to crime and to terrorism. Generations of policymakers, including my generation, were weaned on threat and the need to resist it as the prominent driver of foreign policy. In terms of stirring our emotions and shaping our assumptions, our enemies were almost more important than our friends. Nazi Germany, godless communism, terrorists, Iraq, Iran, now North Korea. That preoccupation with threat has diminished the attention we gave to poor or to developing countries, who were, remember, in Canada's case, potential friends with whom we shared strong links and traditions. Many of those countries can be invaluable allies of Canada now because, among other reasons, our history and society bear few of the scars and assumptions of former colonial or imperial powers. There has been a change in the sources of conflict in the world. Cold War conflict was driven by ideology and often contained by it, by the imposition of power, by the contesting superpowers. Today, the growing source of conflict in the world, the growing sources, are rooted in culture and in identity and in faith. I don't hold to the idea of an inevitable clash of civilizations. Indeed, one of bilingual, multicultural Canada's lessons to the world is that diverse countries can work together and cultures can work together to mutual advantage. But frictions and flashpoints are inevitable. And when they grow, they can metastasize. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrate the limitations of military power alone in dealing with these issues. Many of these conflicts reflect a fear that vital values or identities are under siege. Now, such fears are as old as humankind, but they are much more easily inflamed in an age when information travels so fast and so far, challenging sacred assumptions, creating new aspirations, stimulating anger or envy or extremism. Most of us remember hearing of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was 25 years ago this November. But think of that dramatic change in the context of another transforming event about the same time. This year will also be the 26th anniversary of the widespread use of the internet. More than one wall came down that quarter century ago. And who is to say whether the flood of people from east to west was more or less significant than the flood of information which shrank the world and challenged so many institutions and assumptions? In terms of Canada's position in this internationally changed environment, let me, if I might, suggest a parallel from an earlier time. Canada's international presence changed emphatically in the mid-1940s. Now, I have to tell you that I don't know this personally, but I've read my history, and I know that is what happened. Part of what happened then was that the Second World War forced Mackenzie King to pay a little more attention than he preferred to the larger world outside Canada's borders. So he sent a crop of very able Foreign Service officers out to new diplomatic posts, new friendships, new realities. When the war ended, they came home, eager to apply what they had learned to reshape Canada's post-war policy. But Mackenzie King's caution constrained them. And then, while one should never speak too positively of a foreign minister, along came Louis Saint Laurent, who stood up to King on questions like Korea and opened the way to an unusually active and creative role for Canada, helping shape new international political and security institutions, the United Nations, NATO, the Commonwealth. Saint Laurent was a critical factor. Saint Laurent, the Francophone from Quebec City, was a critical factor in establishing the modern Commonwealth. Establishing new rules of trade, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, new international financial institutions, and after a little while, and after some prodding from Washington, development policy. 7 decades after that great war, different forces have now fashioned another set of changes, which in a comparable way require new eyes and new initiatives. They require, in the phrase made famous by Mr. Gorbachev, new thinking. So let me put some questions to you. Might this be a time for Canada to look deliberately at a new array of alliances, not at all to displace the friends and the bonds we have, but to supplement them and perhaps adapt our talents and traditions to this changing world? To some degree, we have begun to do that, but we are driven more by events than by forward planning. A bad beginning with China, an American pivot toward Asia, Premier Charest's initiative with Europe, a sporadic priority for the Americas, a very late awakening to Africa, and almost all of those in the narrow context of trade. One is tempted to describe that process as going along to get along. But might we not learn from the lessons of Canadian initiatives after the Second World War? Should we not seek more deliberate alliances with countries which share some of our multilateral instincts and our multicultural attributes and our strategic and economic capacity, or have more of that than we might have, so that we might maximize and leverage our own assets. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was a geographic alliance in a time when geography mattered. What matters now? Well, a capacity to understand, respect, and manage cultural diversity matters now, and it matters profoundly. An instinct to innovate matters. So does enough wealth and discipline to pursue initiatives seriously. That's a beginning list. With what other countries might those assets suggest a more active and consistent alliance? With what non-state actors? Among the countries, would Indonesia be one? Would Turkey be one? South Korea? South Africa, if it recovers its promise? Chile? Nigeria? Qatar? Let me just digress, because the former ambassador, Canada's former ambassador to Qatar, is here. And I've never learned to pronounce the name of the country. I'm not going to call it ICAO. As a demonstration of change and possibility, let me detour to Doha. In December, the Carnegie Endowment published an article entitled Qatari Foreign Policy. That foreign policy has become a little more controversial since the article was published, but the article's still relevant. The summary in the Carnegie Endowment, and I quote it, said, Doha wields significant influence in the emerging Middle East and can play a positive role in helping countries in transition. The tiny country, it said, led mediation efforts from Western Sahara to Yemen. It maintains working relations with both Israel and its declared enemies. Al Jazeera's role in captivating viewers across the Arab world fed the momentum of the Arab Spring. Now, another parallel, Qatar could style itself, if it chose, an energy superpower. The North Pars field is the largest natural gas field in the world. But what's interesting is not the rich resource, but the use that has been made of it, based upon a refusal to accept an established old order. Saudi Arabia, Qatar's next-door neighbor, had resisted Qataris' efforts to export their gas via regional pipelines. So, Qatar began investing heavily in liquefied natural gas facilities and can now rely on huge revenues to build a vigorous and autonomous foreign policy. Al Jazeera started in Saudi Arabia as a joint venture called Orbit between the Saudis and the BBC. But the BBC withdrew from the partnership due to Saudi censorship. So Qatar hired many of the BBC-trained journalists and gave Al Jazeera a wide margin of editorial freedom. Could Canada have anything in common with a country like that? On the non-state side, Canada has a long tradition of partnerships with non-state actors and civil society. I know that vividly and personally. That was at the heart of Canadians' response to the boat people, to the Ethiopian famine, to tsunamis and disasters since. The Canadian Labour Congress was an essential partner in the campaign against apartheid. Our response to the tanks in Tiananmen Square was worked out in an extraordinary series of late-night meetings in the Pearson Building, drawing together the wide array of Canadians involved with China. And we came up not only with a consensus, but with a position that endured long after the position of many other countries. Two of the best working models of state, non-state cooperation were shaped by Canada in the Landmines Treaty and the creation of the International Criminal Court. And, just to give a sense of history, in 1967, before CEDA was created, Maurice Strong told the Empire Club, quote, We would like to see our government aid programs complemented and supplemented by voluntary service organizations, church groups, cooperatives, and business and industry. To give it a name, my proposal tonight is to mobilize Canada's soft power capacity to partner with our hard power, which is what successful Canadian governments have done since well before the hard, soft description sprang from Harvard's lips. I understand that soft power is not favored by the government of the day, but I expect it still is favored by the people of the country, and we would be much better off with balance. Now that I've got some applause, I'm going to wind down. But before I do that, I want to leave some questions with you, and I hope that we can have a genuine discussion of this. Does the parallel with the 1940s apply? Does what Canada did in the post-war period, when the world changed and new responses were needed, is that a parallel we should be looking at usefully today? Is this a time for leadership from beside? Is it practical? What models might work? Are non-state actors prepared to ally in any continuing way with governments? Oxfam and Unilever partnered famously in Indonesia a decade ago to everyone's advantage, but it was not at all an easy process. Given the independent nature of NGOs, the resistance may be higher on their side. Globescan reported that last year, if corporations and NGOs collaborated, respect for the corporation went up 75%. Respect for the NGO went down 53%. If the balance between state and non-state actors is going to continue to change, what role might Canada play in the marriage of mandate and imagination? If Canada were interested, how might we determine our natural partners? And who, you might make some suggestions tonight, who might they be? Thank you very much for your attention, and I think the idea now is to open the floor. I'm going to moderate my own questions, if I can see people here, so no one has to begin by saying, Mr. Speaker. Just put a question if you have one. Yeah, fine, there are microphones. Thanks, David. Where are the microphones? One here and one there. This is not so hard.
Ready when you are.
All right.
Testing. Well, hi. First thing I want to do is say what a pleasure it is to be in the presence of a progressive conservative. And I really do mean that. And I've got three things, and you can either ignore them or answer which ones you want, but it does seem that the modern Conservative Party seems to be Northern Republicans, and I'm wondering if you see any opportunity for a resurgence as of the progressive Conservative people in Canada. Now, you referred to corporations as a good guy earlier on, and then you gave several examples of why you think, or why they tend to be perceived as toxic actors, which is my view, and clearly from Globe Views, or is it Worldview, or whatever they are.
Globescan.
Globescan didn't seem to think...
I'll get thrown off the board if you don't get the name right.
Sorry. Globescan didn't seem to find that people thought too highly of them. either. And this sort of leads me to my third point, sort of magically, in that I see these sort of corporations running the United States even more than they do now under our present regime. And America seems to be willing to do, anything to make money. And I sort of see them as at best destructive and at worst damn near, a rogue state. And in that their foreign policy has been driven by 9/11, which many people would argue was not all it appears to be. And in fact, that those cavemen in Afghanistan did a mighty fine job of demolishing those buildings. So I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that, because I think America is in fact the last partner we need.
Well, let me answer some of those briefly, if I might. One, on the progressives, I think this is a progressive country. I think that the present government has won its mandate consecutively for a variety of reasons, and I think it is focused on a small part of the electorate. I think that there may be some pressures internally on that party to change. Certainly there are members of Parliament whom I know who are by inclination progressive. I don't know why we've not heard more from them, but they are there, and there is an electorate there. Is there a chance for a resurgence? I guess I'd answer that without trying to predict, but rather by pointing to the future. This has been a country that, whatever the name, was guided by and large by a progressive, call it a progressive conservative form of government, whether that was under a liberal government or under a progressive conservative government. And I think the country has not changed as much as the government has. Secondly, on the question of corporations, I quoted GlobeScan's statistics, and it was the NGO constituency which saw the popularity of the NGOs fall when collaboration with corporations was encouraged. Who's wrong? Is the NGO community wrong to shut its eyes to options? Be kind of curious, because NGOs historically have searched for options and have found niches where they could make a difference. On corporations, and I am not here to argue their case, but it is, I think most people who observe these matters would agree, there has been a quite remarkable development of what I would call sincere corporate responsibility on the part of a number of corporations, Canadian and other, including a number in the United States. And I think that one has to recognize that there are going to be very strong reasons on all sides not to start something new. There always are. And I don't think we should make judgments about the potential participants before the discussions have begun. I think we should take a very hard look at what might be done. I asked for suggestions as to how we might deal with this. It would be interesting later on, no supplementary questions here, because you asked 3. It would be interesting later on to see if there might be suggestions from this audience as to how that resistance on the part of NGOs might be brought down. Is it entirely unreasonable? If it isn't unreasonable, where is the common ground that might be found? Because I think no one would dispute the value of having more resources turned than is currently the case to some of these problems. The U.S. policy is driven by a number of factors. The U.S. is a country that has challenges of its own. It is also probably, and remains, one of the most resilient countries in history. And it has found its way out of difficult problems in the past, and there's no reason to believe that it won't do that now. I have always argued that Canada is a different North America. And we are a different North America in part because there has always been this emphasis upon the Canadian community to a greater degree than has been the case in, for example, the United States. It is one of the virtues they celebrate, their emphasis upon the individual. One of the virtues we celebrate is our emphasis also, while valuing the individual, while encouraging entrepreneurs, we have also encouraged the sense of community. There are no questions yet from the online community is as submissive and quiet as the in-house community is. So, okay, thank you.
Here's the question.
I'm sorry, I can't see the lights. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. I'm a young man, so this is just a sense I get from my history books. But I have a sense that Canadian regionalism has driven our federal governments to pick kind of the least ambitious or the least troublesome foreign policy options, the one that rocks the boat the least. Do you think that, and do you think that our regionalism will cause problems in implementing kind of the partnership view that you see?
No, I don't. I think a factor about Canadian foreign policy is that it has never been a populist foreign policy. It has been leader-driven. And what is interesting is that a lot of Canadians, when an initiative is proposed, take the question of apartheid. There was a strong opposition to apartheid, but Canada, I don't say this pejoratively, Canada had not been as active before as we became in 1984. And Canadians joined that, and Canadians have supported other measures. So the issue here is not regionalism. It is that for very understandable reasons, there has not been that populist impulse in Canada. Now, that's partly because we are not a great power. If one lived south of the 49th parallel, your policy, the policy your country adopted, would make a more dramatic difference more quickly in more of the world. We do things incrementally. It's very important, but it's not exciting. I always used to say that, who was John Philip Sousa, was it? Was that his name? Would have been driven crazy by Canada. He composed martial music that people march to. Well, we don't march to very much music of that kind. We are a much more conciliatory nation. So I think on regionalism, if you're talking about Quebec as a region, I think, in fact, Quebecers would be more attracted to the thesis I was putting forward tonight than Canadians in some other parts of the country. So they would not be laggards on that question. Would my province of Alberta be a laggard? I don't think so. I think that there is a quite strong Canadian consensus. We've had a lot of examples. I won't bore you with some of them I've survived, but we've had a lot of examples of people coming together. The most dramatic to me, it was rejected, it was the Charlottetown Accord. Now, I'm fully aware that most people in this room and most people in the country voted against it, and that's fine. That's your democratic right. What was extraordinary was to sit in that room with the leaders not only of regions, but of the four representatives of the most excluded groups in our country, our Aboriginal people, and to find absolute agreement on detail after a long process. We can do this in the country if we try. That's the challenge. And the trying very often in our history has had to come from leadership rather than necessarily from a populist impulse. One last thing on that. I am struck by the growth in organizations and institutions, universities, that are turning attention to international affairs. It is more than what I remember when I was a young man. And that has to connect. That has to have some consequences. We also live in a global age. People are more aware of more things. That has to make a difference. So there is an opportunity for leadership here. It has to be based upon a consensus, but consensus can be built in this country. Yeah.
In your view, to what degree does the leading from beside model depend on an activist role of the national government? If you have a more minimalist sort of foreign policy from a government, let's say, that's focused on a domestic prosperity agenda or trade, international trade, can a coalition of like-minded NGOs, corporations, civil society carry the day and create an activist role for Canada with a lesser participation from the government? Would it succeed, or is it really dependent on the hard power participation?
No, that's a very important question, and I think obviously, as I said, it depends upon leadership. I should point out that this government is activist on some international issues, so activism is not foreign to their attitudes. And they have some elements that are very open to grassroots and to some of the non-governmental community. They tend to be in fairly specific niches, but to answer the question directly, I think it requires an activist government. My prejudice is that Canada requires an activist government for domestic as well as international reasons, but I think that is the case. But if the government won't start the debate, Why shouldn't we tonight? Yes.
Hello, sir. Now, I think that there are certainly examples of large groups, non-governmental groups doing good work. You have, for example, Rotary International has partnered with different groups, the Gates Foundation included, to put an end to polio, and it's not as publicized as perhaps it should be. So is there maybe a perception that those sort of relationships don't work because the negative effects, the economists who say these large scale projects don't work, that you need these smaller piecemeal sort of solutions? You know, if we did more work to focus on the positive, would we be a little bit better off with the solution, pursuing a solution like the one that you've presented?
Well, let me try two answers to that. One is the whole concept of development has changed quite dramatically. And I won't try to enumerate all the changes because I don't know them all. But when Canada was persuaded by the United States to embark in the Colombo Plan all those decades ago, development was about large projects. It is no longer that. Secondly, there's absolutely no doubt that organizations like Rotary do very important work. They do it on their own. They do it in part because they are on their own, because it is community service. But public servants are involved in public service. Why can we not find a way to marry public service and community service? They're not foreign fields. The instincts are the same. And so I don't think there is a danger of stifling groups like Rotary or others. I think, in fact, the likelihood is if we thought about formula and tried to implement some of them, we could find ways to extend quite dramatically the effectiveness. I was with Rotarians a year ago in Grand Prairie, Alberta, and I was astounded, to learn what they are doing. People from little towns I used to represent in the House of Commons, things I know nothing about. So there is a question of turning attention to what is already being done. But whatever it is, I can tell you it isn't enough to meet the need. So what we have to look for are ways in which we can meet the need more effectively and more cooperatively. And I don't think there's a risk here. Am I answering your question?
Well, you are, but I also think that there's such a focus on all of the things that haven't worked out when you look at these large-scale projects. Something like the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. There's such an attention on all of the things that have not been done, that our governments and our multilateral organizations haven't been able to accomplish. That is there a need to focus on the things that have been done, if only to reassure people that those sort of projects can be successful?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. The tougher question is how do you do that? Not being critical of the media, and I'm not speaking of specific outlets, modern media looks for bad news and looks for instant news. And good news is not of interest, and instant solutions don't work. They have to be developed over time. So in a sense, this is a depressing factor to work with, but it's there. And we've worked against depressing factors before and found success. That would be my response to that. I have, lo and behold. Well, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. A fascinating presentation. I don't know whether it's a coincidence, but Mr. Kofi Annan is in Ottawa today at the Global Center for Pluralism and talking about pluralism. And this is a tremendous, I had a choice between listening to you or to listening to him, and I came here, and I'm glad that I did. What you're saying is much more relevant to Canada. The question that I have is, what you talked about was the massive change the world is going through, specifically with regards to culture, interaction with people from different parts of the world, coming at a massive scale to us. Kurt Lewin, a famous psychologist and an organizational guru, said that societies and people need to change. They need to learn faster than the change that is coming to them. So the question that I have for you is, and you posed a lot of questions to us to reflect on, which we will, and I'm hopefully will come up with some of the answers that you were looking for. But my question would be, is are we doing enough in Canada and internationally to unlearn our habits and behaviors and mindsets to keep up with the change that is coming to us? And do we have deliberate policies infrastructures to facilitate the change that is coming to us, and to be ready for the world that's in the next 20, 30 years?
That's a critical question. My answer, I guess, to begin with, was no, we're not doing enough. We don't have those infrastructures. I hope conversations like this, and indeed the kind of work that Kofi Annan is doing around the world and that the Center for Pluralism may encourage that. But we have to take these general sentiments and focus them into practical steps that might be taken. Are Canadians open to these changes? Are they aware of them? A lot are. A lot in this room obviously are. A lot of others are. Those of us who know these things or who are aware of some of these changes have to encourage others to look at things that they may not have considered before. Remember that first, this world is very complicated, but secondly, individuals are frustrated. They say, what can I do about that? If they see something on television and they are outraged that something like this should happen. But then the practical question comes, what can I do about that? Well, in fact, there are things that individuals can do. That's how a lot of change has occurred. And one of the other realities of our age is that more people know more than they did before. And I think educators would know this better than I, but I think there is an openness to learning things, an openness to asking questions and looking for answers. So I believe that some progress can be made this way, but it does require practical initiatives that create infrastructure, that create models, that make sure that facts are known, that make sure that people like me know what Rotary's doing when I hadn't before, let alone non-governmental organizations I've never heard of. Is that part of an answer? Thank you. I have something on the screen. What do you see as the benefit of leadership? Given the costs, why should Canada seek out a leadership role? This is from Mike M. Certainly in Canada, on international policy, and probably more generally, not much happens without leadership. So people have to step up to get some of these done. Given the costs, why should Canada seek out a leadership role? Because we can. And if one looks at costs, one should also look at benefits. One should look at the costs of doing nothing, the costs of our not taking initiatives. Who in the world, is Nicaragua going to be able to take initiatives of this kind? Are most of the countries of the world going to be able to do that? Many of them could, in some kind of partnership with us, identifying roles that they could play and roles that we could play. But are they able to play that kind of leadership? I don't think so. One of the gifts of a country that is as fortunate as ours is that we have the chance to do these things. But it's also an obligation, I would argue, and it is also a danger if we don't. I think one of the grave threats to Canada is that we could become a gated community. We could become psychologically a gated community, saying the world is out there and we're in here. Or indeed worse, saying we'll go out in the morning and go to profit from what's going on in the world, but we'll come back in the afternoon and night and we'll shut the doors of our gated community. That's a very real risk for this country. And this is a country, I don't want to dwell too long on this theme because some of you have heard it before. I've always argued that Canada is an act of will. We're not a natural country. And we have created a country, and we have done that by an act of will, and we've done that because a combination of leadership and civic response have made that happen. If we settle in behind gates, we won't do that, and we will diminish. So that's the answer, I believe, to Mike M's question. Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I appreciated your remarks. Especially the comment about cultural understanding and the need to build bridges in this day and age. Linking that to your memory of the 4 Aboriginal leaders being present at the negotiations for the Charlottetown Accords, When you talk about partnership and the need for Canada to, if I could infer, be strong internally to impact strong externally, I have a heart and concern for the Aboriginal people of our country these days, especially seeing the Idle No More protests that have occurred and recent events. Without going in depth, they number over 1 million Canadians collectively and are by far the youngest demographic in our country. I believe the median age is about 13 years younger for Aboriginal Canadians and non-Aboriginals. My question is, how can Canada internally partner Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians in strong bridge-building ways that bridge cultural understandings that might not have been present up to this time in our country to forge a bright future for us all?
Let me begin. First of all, that is the area, that is the weakness in Canada that is our most severe weakness. That is our failure, the question of our relation with Aboriginal, with First Nations and other Aboriginal people. And I don't just say that because everybody says it. If you look at how strong we are and where our weaknesses are and how terrible the conditions are among Aboriginal people, that is the fact. But to go back to a comment a moment ago, there has been more progress in Aboriginal relations than we know. The bad news gets attention. The bad news is terrible. But for example, in places like the Northwest Territories, housing problems have been solved by local initiative and by governments, often territorial or regional governments. There has been, again in the North, a quite extraordinary reversal of the exclusion from major economic decisions of Aboriginal people that occurred with the first Northern Pipeline, for example, that gave rise to the public hearings, and the most recent proposal for a pipeline, which turns out it may not be economic, but it at least has a consensus that was hard won among Aboriginals and others. There are successes, they need to be known. But the sense is of failure. That's the reputation, and we have to address that. And part of one thing we have to do is begin to celebrate and advertise some of the successes. But secondly, we have to find specific new successes, areas where agreement can be found on how to move forward, not necessarily in a global response, but very specifically, issue by issue. And you spoke about Idle No More. I think as historians look back, they may come to the view that Idle No More caused some change in Canadian attitudes. I have been surprised that the positive sense towards Aboriginal people that I found among non-Aboriginals during the negotiations of the Charlottetown Accord had waned. And it is still lower now than it was then. But I think that there has been a change, a sense that this is a real problem where there have to be some responses. And I think that Aboriginal leaders are also aware that they have to find ways to make themselves more effective. They have to find ways to agree on common steps forward rather than finding things to fight about. I worked a long time, still do, with the Assembly of First Nations. It is a federation. It is a very challenged federation because it has more parts that are more difficult than the provinces are in the Canadian Federation, and it requires work. I believe that there is some evidence that both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal leaders are beginning to look for practical ways that we can move forward together that, among other things, will change the image of the issue as a serious problem that can be solved, as distinct from a serious problem that we keep ignoring or failing to solve. I can't be specific. I could be specific, but I'm not going to be tonight on some of the things that could be done, because there are discussions about some of the ways forward, and they are cross-cultural discussions. I'm sorry, I have another one. Yep, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for your remarks tonight. I'm going to pick up on an answer that you gave to somebody else a few minutes ago, and I've been thinking that since you started speaking. What can we as individual Canadians do? I'm going to hazard a guess that the people in this room tonight vote, pay taxes, and probably many people here volunteer. I mean, we're doing a lot, or as much as we can. What else can we do? What do we need to be doing to help move this along?
Well, this is immodest to say, but I put a proposal out tonight, and it's far from perfect, but it's worth, I put a couple of related proposals out. I'd like you to think about that. I'd like to figure out some way to assess responses. I imagine CG would be prepared to host that, because I think there's no point making speeches or feeling despair. One has to find some ways to move forward. I think not to repeat my arguments, but I think that there's obviously a lot of fault in those arguments. They're not, but I think they need to be examined. I think some of the tougher questions have been addressed tonight, have been mentioned tonight, namely the attitudes of potential partners toward one another. Would there be a willingness on the part of a Canadian government to lead? Would there be a willingness on the part of an NGO to become involved in some kind of long-term cooperation with a government entity? How might we move on both of those? Those are, they sound a little airy-fairy. Those, in fact, are practical questions, and I think that we should have some answers on that. Secondly, I'm sure others in the room have learned things tonight about things that NGOs, for example, are doing in the world that we didn't know before. And we should all make it a point to learn more. I shouldn't have had to appear by accident at a Rotary meeting to find out the quite extraordinary things that this national organization is doing. And I think we also have to, if I may say so, surrender our prejudices. We all belong to sort of schools of thought, and we're there for a reason, and we think we're right and the other guys are wrong, or that people who might have happened to act against us at some point in the past are irretrievable. That's not the case. I think we have to recognize that if we are going to generate some common movement forward, we have to surrender some of our own prejudices. And that's an important step to common ground. But to come specifically to the question, I think that I hope that some of you will respond to some of the questions I raised. I'd be interested to know which other countries you think might be interesting allies for Canada willing to work with us. I'd be interested in knowing what non-state organizations might be willing to be involved in some kind of leadership from beside, and how that might occur. I think I put the general proposition out. You can now fill in the details. I'm not, that's far too facetious, but we all have to do that. We all have to try to, if the proposition is at all valid, let us then consider how we might move on it. I have another electronic question. Just let me go to the world. What cause do you think Canada is best poised to champion? Is there an appetite for global leadership in our current government? This is from Jill in Ottawa. I believe a cause that Canada should champion is in fact conciliation of differences. I think that's what we do in the country. I think that is very much what the world needs. I think we have credibility on the question. I say we collectively, we as a society have credibility on that issue. We want to be careful in our own country that we are continuing to earn that reputation as fully as we had in the past. I think by and large we are. There are going to be eruptions, but I think that question of conciliation is a cause, and that leads to multilateralism. I think we simply have to be involved with others formally in the world. It's not simply that we were the architects of some of these institutions, we were partial architects of some of these institutions which are now being questioned. It is that those institutions are valuable in and of themselves. It's not who created them that's important. It's what they can do that's important. And what they can do, I think, this question of cooperation is is critical. The government shows leadership on some issues internationally, so yes, there's an appetite. There is an appetite, and there may well be a response to reasoned proposals. I think one always has to believe that about governments. Sir.
Good evening, Mr. Clark, and thank you so much for coming to our community. I hope you can come back often. I have 3 quick examples to cite to make sure you're aware of, and then one challenge. And the examples are, across the street is the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, and Dr. Turek, I don't know if he's in the audience tonight, but he has an amazing series of institutes that he's just starting across Africa and with involvement from around the world. And unfortunately, I have to say, in theoretical physics, gray hair is not the asset that it may be in international governance, but they recognize that they need to encourage young minds wherever they are. And this partnership and involvement around the world is just a wonderful thing. If you don't have a chance to get across the street, well, look up Neil Turek, Perimeter Institute. So I don't think he's here. The second one would be the Mennonite Relief Sale. This weekend, our community is fairly well known for its Mennonite involvement. The relief sale's out in New Hamburg. Drop by, pick up a quilt. The big news in town on Monday will be what the top one sold for, and it could be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. A wonderful opportunity and involvement. The third one, Engineers Without Borders. Our local university is involved in that. The challenge is, I work in technology, but I work with a number of environmental NGOs. And it's tough in that sector these days. And so I'm wondering
It's
if
tough
you...
in what sector, sorry?
Environmental
Yep.
NGOs. The government has essentially told them that if they don't toe the government line, they'll lose charitable status. And so I'm wondering who to partner with if it can't be the government. I know in this area we tend not to look to the government first, but oftentimes NGOs in the environmental sector are local issue based with an international message. And I'm wondering how that works in your model and if you have advice. Or is it a think about?
No, it depends on the level of the partnership. It seems to me that if we are able to put in place a concept of leading from beside and involving sincerely some non-governmental organizations in it, that will not likely start at a local level, but it will have implications for a local level. And it may be that if there's an internal debate, people who have worked in Kitchener-Waterloo with adversaries on some of these issues and found some common ground will be helpful in that debate. This is only an impression, but my impression is that the government's, I won't say their line is softening, but their line with regard to, they are becoming more conscious of the need to have the support of environmental organizations, I believe. And I think that that's an opportunity which you should take advantage of. I say more conscious, but I think that that should be done. And I know too little about the Perimeter Institute, but I'll look and take a look, and thank you very much. Chris.
Just two kind of questions. One, why do you think Canadians are good at multilateralism, partnership, and even collaboration? You know, why is that something that we excel at internationally? And if this is a valuable commodity or skill set for the future you describe, what's the most optimistic scenario? 20, 30 years out, if we can harness our skill set, what's our contribution to the world, and what could it look like?
We are a multilateral country. We have been domestically. I mean, look at les caisses populaires, look at the credit unions, look at the co-ops. They sprouted up all across the country. They weren't sort of copied from one to another. A movement began in Quebec spontaneously from the grassroots level that became the Caisse movement, as strong as the Farmers Union in Alberta. Similar kinds of roots. That's part of being a northern country, I think. We know we need each other. And there has been, that has manifested itself in a tradition that by and large has been a Canadian tradition. We have acted together. We've acted together to do things, whether it was a national broadcaster, which might be controversial now, but it was essential at the time. A national airline was essential at the time. We created a national healthcare system. We have done these kinds of things. We are a community, and we need, I believe, to draw out the elements of that, draw out and celebrate the elements of that community. I don't know that I can answer. Chris is the CEO of GlobeScan. He studies issues and makes considered projections. And here he's asking me to offer a wild guess on something that is within his field of competence. I can't answer that specifically, except I think it's fair to say that if a country like Canada doesn't address these issues, things, however you define them, will get worse. We face the threat of gates around our community. We're not the only one. And if a country like Canada puts up gates, there's an incentive to others. And if a country like Canada opens gates, that's an incentive to others. How can you quantify or predict? I can't do that. But I believe the question is important, but I can't do that. What I can do, I think, is try to indicate a promising place to start. A promising place to start on a promising path. I have one. I've just answered that. Excuse me. Do these never go off? Was this question for me, or was it for the speaker 2 months ago? Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. And for a few concluding remarks, and very briefly, first of all, thanks to you, Mr. Clark, for your exceptional address and the discussion this evening. The challenge of your topic, Leading from Beside, is really a challenge to all of us here in the room and in the online audience, all Canadians, because as you made clear, while the national government still must lead, there's a tremendous opportunity for Canadians through civil society, through NGOs, through business, through the groups and clubs that we're members of, to really make a difference in the world, that Canada can punch above its weight, play a role in shaping a better world, and you suggested some of the areas and the causes, the conciliation areas where we could lead. So thank you for inspiring us to do more and do better. And really we owe you thanks for many things, for the generous gift of your time tonight and your remarks and your thoughts, for the contribution you've made to our country, the incredible legacy you've given us in your own career, and for the generous time you're giving us tomorrow at the Balsley School. The audience may not know this, but Mr. Clark is spending time with the students at the Balsley School tomorrow. They're presenting their policy briefs and ideas, and he's helping to mentor them. And I know that you're a frequent visitor to our community. I know that you were here only recently to help pay respects to a community leader and a friend of yours. So you give often, and of your time and of other things. So we thank you very much for all of that and for your remarks tonight. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience here for attending. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to our website in our online archive, so you can visit that again. You can comment on the blogs about tonight's event. That'll be posted soon. And I just want to let you know about our next event in the CG Auditorium. It will be our final signature lecture this season, and it'll take place on June 12th when CG and the Canadian International Council's Waterloo Region branch present their 6th annual media panel. This year's theme, Caught in the Headlines, Everyday Voices in World News. This features Doug Saunders of the Globe and Mail, Stuart Bell of the National Post, Linda Diebel of the Toronto Star, Alison Smith of CBC Radio, and our most excellent moderator will be Steve Paikin of TV Ontario. And that event starts at 7 p.m. on June 12th. So be sure to register for our events newsletter for information on this and all the other upcoming signature lectures that we're already planning for our new season, which resumes in September So thank you once more to our event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for coming. And let me just add that our featured speaker tonight, our guest of honor, will pause briefly in the lobby. We have a reception, a coffee reception or some water, so you can linger and speak to our guests. Please resist the urge to come down and mob him at the stage here. Please proceed out to the lobby, and he will join you there for conversations for a short while. Thank you very much.